One day a brave hero stood one step away from defeating a powerful demon. At last, the kid only spoke of how long the mighty demon king Madalnaz was able to hold out, and then swung his sword to deliver the final blow. But the monster shouted to the hero that this was not all and the demon kings would surely come after him in untold numbers. That was all. Eventually the hero managed to subdue the demon king. If this had been one of the RPG games he had once played, the credits would be rolling now. A few years ago, this hero was summoned from Earth as a hero, and now he would finally be free. The kingdom of Hajimno. After the hero's triumph, he was summoned to the king for a ceremony. All the people of the kingdom gathered at this ceremony to congratulate the hero Shoto on his victory. They cheered and praised the young fighter. King Zamasul I was also very happy about the hero's victory, for it was because of Shoto that this world was saved. The king prepared a special reward for Shoto. So, the daughter of King Zamasul I, Princess Trapier, the king declared that he would marry Shoto to this beauty. The princess, meanwhile, sat on the throne carefree with discontent, and when her father introduced her, she began to smile at the hero. Then the girl approached Shoto and suggested to him to make the kingdom better. Trapier argued that Shoto would make the kingdom better with his deadly weapons. Thus, the girl raised her hand and shouted to the audience that by standing at the head of the kingdom, she and Shoto were uniting the world. After these words, everyone began to cheer and praise the Hajimno kingdom. So, the people are all excited and it seems that the story should end with the wedding with the princess. Shoto, however, had other plans. He asked loudly if he could return to his world. This question puzzled everyone. In fact, Shoto did not belong to this world. One day, he was unexpectedly called here. And then, saying that Shoto was now a hero, he was handed a stick, sent to kill the demon king, and thrown out penniless. Every day all Shoto did was fight, fight, fight. In the end, the hero just got tired of living like this. Then the king responded to Shoto's request to return. He declared that the mania that had called Shoto here was a single ticket. Therefore, there is simply no way to bring the hero back. These words horrified Shoto. Trapier, on the other hand, said that the Hajimno kingdom is strong because of the hero, so there's no point in coming up with a way to send them back. So the king asked Shoto to forget about it and marry Trapier. The king assured that together with the princess they would make the kingdom great. Shoto understood everything. He had been deceived. They had no thought of sending him back. So the hero never stopped shouting that he wanted to go back to Earth. He missed his phone, online games, and konbini. He missed lying unkempt on his bed and eating sweets while spinning gacha. And then, when Shoto woke up in the morning thinking he'd be late for class, he remembered that he'd already finished school and hadn't found a job. No worries at all. The hero just wanted it all back. But the king and certainly the princess didn't seem to care about that. Suddenly, Shoto wondered what on earth was happening now if he was stuck here. The king at this time again proposed to Shoto to be betrothed to the princess. The princess at this moment said to herself under her breath, "Scum." The king heard this word and asked if it was him she had just said it about. Shoto's only thought at this time was that he wouldn't be able to have fun in this world. No manga, no anime. The hero also thought about the fact that most likely his favorite title was already over. The king at this time had already decided everything for Shoto. He instantly ordered the servants to start preparing for the banquet. Of course, getting married was not for Shoto, so he was against the whole thing. The king, however, decided that if he announced at the banquet that Shoto's hero was engaged to the princess, Shoto would definitely not be turned away. Shoto at this point realized that he was just being put on the spot, so he asked them to leave him alone. The guy then rushed to run away from the ball like Cinderella. He claimed that he wouldn't let the king do that. But no sooner had Shoto escaped than he was grabbed by the edge of his clothes. It was the princess. She stated that what Shoto is doing now is disrespectful, after which the girl decided to add a little more acting and asked Shoto if he was displeased with her. Shoto was confused. He knew that Trapier was not a bad person, but the girl's look was very intimidating. Shoto couldn't just tell her that. Trapier, meanwhile, was thinking that if Shoto proved to be too difficult, he could have his legs cut off, because as long as the kingdom had heroes, the rest didn't matter. The princess was determined to protect the country. Then Shoto thought of something and declared that their marriage was impossible for physiological reasons. This statement infuriated Trapier, but this was exactly what Shoto wanted. He knew that now the princess would definitely understand him correctly and began to walk away again. But the king could not let Shoto escape. He ordered all his servants to catch the hero. Immediately after the order, a magic storm and a magic net fell on Shoto. Shoto's hands and feet were now bound. The hero was outraged at such an impertinence of the king. But compared to the attacks of the Demon King and King Zamasul's generals, this was only a breeze for Shoto. At this moment, Trapier has also joined in to keep Shoto at bay. In her hands, an axe appeared in her hands from nowhere. Looking at the girl, Shoto altogether felt an aura like a Demon King. From fear, the hero even managed to free his legs from the magic net. Because of that, the guy began to quickly get his feet away from the evil princess. Using the speed magic called Beedish, Shoto broke through the wall and flew outside. The king ordered all the Sig servants to go in pursuit of Shoto. The princess was not happy either. She was determined to be sure to make Shoto her own. Shoto at this time continued to move rapidly away from the kingdom. He was disappointed, for he believed that he could return to Earth. The hero who defeated the Demon King escaped from the kingdom. Maybe this would be the beginning of his wanderings. If you go through one old RPG in its entirety, such a thing is also possible there. At this moment, looking at the ground, Shoto saw a river. He decided that it would be good for him to take a breather. Therefore, the guy used the mania neutralization to spit directly into the river. But what a pity that Shoto's accuracy in controlling magic was a problem. He landed not in the river, but on the ground nearby. Lying on the broken ground, Shoto thought about how he would have definitely died if he had a lower level. Now, having risen, Shoto decided to take a drink of water. Picking up the water in his hands, the hero was surprised at how clean it was and was about to drink, as, suddenly, there was someone shouted, "Stop." It was a certain beautiful ogre girl who explained to Shoto that this water could not be drunk. The girl assured him that the water must first be filtered and then boiled. Shoto didn't stop that and drank the water anyway, marveling at the fact that he had just met an ogre girl. The girl, on the other hand, was a little surprised that Shoto still drank the water despite what she had told him. In just a moment, Shoto had already plopped down on the ground and clutched his stomach. At that moment, the father of the girl named Katrina appeared. He approached her and asked her what had happened. Katrina's father then turned to Shoto and asked if it was true that he had drunk the river water, to which the hero replied that it was quite possible. Then the man wondered. They did not know what was contained in this water. Catherine at this point decided to go and get some herbs to get the poison out of Shoto's system. Shoto was already on his feet at this time. He thought about how he had no idea that water could have such side effects, because up until now he had only bought water and drank it. Well, anyway, Shoto was glad that he had become a little smarter. The hero then used a poison neutralization magic called Doctor. Thus, the guy cured himself in the blink of an eye. Catherine's father, looking at this, was amazed and asked Shoto if he was a wizard. Shoto realized that he would be in trouble if his pursuers suddenly heard that he had been here. So Shoto said he was just some guy who could do magic. These words did not confuse Father Catherine. Shoto, on the other hand, decided to be careful with this ogre even though he didn't seem to be hostile. At that moment, Catherine returned with the antidote. Just in time, seeing a healthy Shoto, the girl asked if his stomach had gone. To which Shoto wanted to reply that he had just used magic, but the guy noticed the scratches on Catherine's arm. He realized that she was trying and gathering medicinal herbs for his sake. So Shoto turned on his acting skills and asked Catherine to give him this medicinal herb urgently. The girl gave Shoto the herb and he quickly started crunching it. After which the hero declared that the herb had helped him and Catherine had just saved him. But Catherine doubted that this medicinal herb was so fast acting. Shoto, however, decided to get out of it and said that he was the kind of person that medicines help instantly. In that case, Catherine was very glad that Shoto was feeling better. But the hero did not like the fact that the girl hurt herself because of him. Catherine, on the other hand, thought that it was just an abrasion and nothing wrong with it. Shoto reached out to the girl's arm and used the recovery magic called instantaneous healing. In an instant, all of Catherine's abrasions were gone. The girl was amazed and asked Shoto if he knew how to use magic, to which the hero replied that he just does a little sorcery. Then Catherine wondered. After all, since Shoto knows how to use magic, he didn't need medicinal herbs at all. The girl knew about the magic of neutralizing poison. Shoto, on the other hand, claimed that it was not at all. The boy assured that he was such a person that sometimes he could not get rid of the poison. Catherine was puzzled and asked, "Is that even how?" At this time, Catherine's father was watching the two. Suddenly, something made him smile. He approached Shoto and asked him if he was going somewhere. Shoto began by asking him to listen carefully. He then grandiosely stated that he was just wandering aimlessly. These words surprised Catherine and her father a little at first. But after a moment, Catherine chuckled. Then all three of them laughed. After a while, Catherine's father said that he was afraid to leave Shoto alone, for he might eat the poisonous mushroom and die. So he invited Shoto to his house. Immediately, the man also warned the hero that he would need his help. Shoto, however, pounded the man's chest with his fist and asked him if he was afraid to invite a man he was seeing for the first time to visit. Catherine's father only remained silent and rubbed Shoto's head. He was amused that this was said to him by a young man who had foolishly drunk the river water and was rolling on the ground in pain. Catherine at this point remarked that her father was very persistent and self-sufficient. The young man then realized that self-sufficiency was a quality that he, too, needed for his new life. So the boy shook the man's hand and agreed to help him gladly. Afterwards, the man introduced himself and his daughter. As it turned out, he was a woodcutter named Brust, and his daughter Catherine was standing next to him. Then Shoto decided to introduce himself as well. Out of habit, he wanted to say that he was the hero Shoto, But he came to his senses and it turned out that Shoto's new name would be Jerash. Shoto decided that he renounced his status as a hero and would henceforth live a life far from battles. Clenching his hand into a fist and holding it to his chest, the hero called his name and declared that he was going to the mountains for the first time and was very happy to meet Catherine and Brust. Catherine and Brust were also very happy to meet Chodao. After this, Catherine and Brust began to leave, but Chodao remained standing still. Catherine noticed this and said they were going that way, beckoning Shoto to come with them. Then Shoto already confidently set off after Catherine and Brust. So begins a new quiet life for the hero Shoto. On the way he first found a mushroom, which he was very happy about, but Catherine managed to tell the hero in time that this mushroom is deadly poisonous. So, here was the beginning of Shoto's new quiet life. But there was one problem. The guy didn't know what he was even supposed to do. Catherine, who was watching Chodao, was very amused that the guy was so nervous. When Brust brought Chodao to his house, the first thing he asked the lad was if he knew how to chop wood. To which Shoto thought for a bit and replied that he had seen it done in anime. Of course, Brust didn't know what anime was and asked Shoto about it. He decided not to wait for an explanation and show Shoto how to chop wood. He stuck the axe into the wood and then lifted the axe with it. Brust then struck the wood against the tree and the axe chopped the piece into 2 pieces. Chodao was delighted and amazed at this activity. The young man even clapped his hands. Without thinking long, he decided to try chopping wood too. Using the vault, he began to get what he thought was a suitable tool. And the suitable tool for firewood he thought was the sacred sword X Ragnarok Caliber, the blade that the gods created to subdue the Demon King. It can create a magical beam. Seeing that Shoto was going to chop wood with such a sword, Brust was dumbfounded. Shoto, on the other hand, argued that he just had to try it. Lastly, the young man thought that stabbing a log was like cutting soft tofu for him. So he decided to hit the tree with the sacred ball with all his might. As he struck the tree with the sword, Shoto's tremendous strength spread over a great distance and split the mountain in 2. Seeing this, Brust fell off his feet. Catherine fainted altogether, but Chodao managed to pick her up. As he held the girl, the young man smelled her pleasant odor. After a moment, Catherine woke up and anxiously asked what had just happened. Shoto, however, decided to remedy the situation a little and used the time magic called Rewind. The young man only wanted to rewind time quite a bit. When Shoto rewound time, Catherine and Brust felt strange. Brust felt as if something had recently happened, but Chodao claimed that Brust was just imagining things. In fact, all those skills and equipment don't really help at all in ordinary life. So Shoto sat down on a log and started trying to chop wood again, but with an axe. To begin with, he stuck the axe into the wood as Brust had shown him. Then the young man struck with all his might, and 2 pieces flew right into his eyes. Chodao hit so hard that the wood stuck in his eyes. The boy cried out in pain, and Catherine began to help him. But after a couple of seconds, Shoto came to his senses and said that everything was alright and he was not affected by such things. Catherine was dumbfounded. Brust, on the other hand, saw what had happened to Chodao. He assured that this often happens to newcomers because they put too much force. Brust claimed that chopping wood could be done even with Catherine's strength. So the girl sat down on a log and began to show the lad how to chop wood. At this moment, looking at the girl, Shoto thought that in Brust's house, where he and his daughter do everything, the hero should definitely be able to cope. Probably, with one movement of her hand, Catherine managed to split the wood properly and not hurt anyone. Shoto was delighted. He surrounded the girl and began to praise her. He also remarked already aloud how good she smelled. After a while, Brust approached Chodao and asked him if he was getting anywhere. The man also said that Catherine became embarrassed and ran to her room. But this is actually the first time Brust has ever talked to a new acquaintance for so long. He liked the likes of Chodao. At that moment, Catherine came back and started beating her father with her fists and asking him to stop talking. Brust, on the other hand, only laughed. Chodao liked what Brust said about liking people like Chodao. At this point, the angry Catherine decided to go make some food. When the girl left, Brust confessed to Chodao that he was very happy that his daughter had an acquaintance of her age. So Brust asked Chodao to keep Catherine company while the boy was here. Chodao did not mind at all. He firmly stated that he would take care of Catherine, besides he could learn a lot from her. First of all, the boy should learn how to chop wood. So he began to practice. In the end, Shoto succeeded. After he practiced a little, he mastered chopping wood. It was like defeating a high-level monster. After that, wood can be made into charcoal. It is used for cooking, heating, and warming water. What was interesting to the joyful Chodao was that he continued to develop as a novice woodcutter, even though he had discarded the title of hero. These words the young man said aloud. Brust, who was passing by, heard the words about the hero and asked Shoto about it, to which Shoto refused to answer. After a while, when Shoto had chopped quite a lot of firewood, Brust said that now they would definitely have enough firewood and praised Shoto for a good job. Brust also promised to show Shoto later how else the wood could be used. These words surprised Shoto. He had no idea how else wood could be used. Oh, this unexplored quiet life. Suddenly, Shoto thought about the fact that this seemed like a challenge. When it was already dark and the month was clearly visible in the night starry sky, Catherine, Brost and Chodao sat down to dinner. There was boiled rice for dinner, to which Chodao was very surprised. The boy confessed that he had thought of eating only meat in such a faraway place. An overjoyed Shoto began to gulp down the rice with great speed. Catherine was dumbfounded looking at the eagerness with which Shoto was swallowing the food. After a few seconds, the guy asked for more. Catherine simply could not refuse the young man. Brost noticed that Shoto liked the spices Catherine had added. He also asked Chodao to raid the food since they were having a stew tonight. Brost remarked that if Chodao had not been here, he and Catherine would have stretched the meat out for 3 days, but now could whip it up in no time. Catherine, however, while putting the stew on her plate, asked Brost if it was from the big boar he had caught. The girl thought that fresh meat was best used to make a stew. A couple of seconds later, Catherine had already served Chodao, who was drooling from his mouth, a second dish. Along with the meat was broth and fat. Nothing is wasted. Picking up the meat and broth in a spoon, Shoto noticed how Catherine had cooked the meat deliciously. It smelled like a beast. Finally, Shoto put the first spoonful into his mouth. The taste amazed Shoto. He began to put one spoonful after another into his mouth. The herbs gave the dish a very unusual flavor. After the first plate, Shoto asked for more until he burped and realized he was full. Russ remarked that Shoto had eaten as many as 7 plates, even though the boy could not be expected to eat that much. Shoto, however, explained that he had to expend a lot of energy, all because of his magic and skills. Shoto then addressed Catherine with strange words. Gachaizo Samechida. The girl did not understand what this meant and asked Shoto. Shoto, however, explained that in his native country these words meant thank you for the food, it was very tasty. Catherine, on the other hand, thanked Shoto for eating everything. Then Shoto began to get up from the table with a plate in his hands. Catherine asked the young man if he was going for more, but Shoto learnt many important things as he came into this world. So the young man stated that he wanted to wash the dishes. Then Catherine said that in that case there was a barrel of water outside. Chodao went out of the house and tried to find the barrel. It was very dark outside. Only the month was lit. Staring up at the starry sky, Shoto thought about the fact that he had defeated the Demon King a couple of days ago and had come to the palace today, and then immediately fled from there. And now he is sitting at the table with the ogre family, having eaten stew to his heart's content. Then Shoto realized that it was simply impossible to predict how life would turn out. And it all began when he was called into this world. At that moment the guy was called by Catherine and said that they had drawn a bath. The girl invited Chodao to go there too. Without thinking long, the lad rushed after Catherine. Catherine added that she had to think of a way to heat the bath water. Then Chodao thought for a moment. After all, if there is water for washing dishes, there is also water for the bath. Then the young man suggested heating it outside with firewood. Catherine liked this idea. So, the mission to heat the bath water began. This task Chodao asked to be left to him. Russ noticed how determined Chodao was. Shoto, on the other hand, stated that he would show him how to handle such a difficult job with ease. Catherine, on the other hand, merely wished Shoto good luck. After these words, Shoto set to work. To begin with, he took wood that he had chopped himself. When Shoto saw the whole construction, he had questions. The boy understood why the cooker was needed from below, but wasn't the bathtub wooden? Then why doesn't it burn? After a short time of thinking, Shoto realized everything. There is an iron vat under the bathtub in which the water boils. As soon as the water is hot, a wooden plank is lowered to the bottom. And all this happens right under the open sky. Atmospheric. So, to begin with, Chodao decided to pour water into the bathtub. Then he threw in some firewood and coals for kindling. After that, the young man used a fire magic called Start Small. Immediately, the firewood burst into flames and the water in the bathtub began to heat up. At that moment, Catherine walked over to the bathtub wearing only a towel. The engrossed Chodao did not even notice her. He only passionately watched the fire so that it did not get too hot. The boy realized that he could now boast of his skills as a hero. But Shoto also realized that he was not a hero at the moment, but Shoto's boiler boy. At that moment, Catherine stealthily climbed into the bathroom. The water was warm. It was only at this moment that Shoto noticed Catherine. He pictured in his head how Catherine was already enjoying the bathtub and talking about how much she loved bathing. The sight of this scene in his head filled him with pride and his mouth drooled. At this point, Catherine looked out of the bathtub and said that the water was just fine. The girl even suggested that he might have a talent for it. This was unexpected and pleasing to Chodao. At this moment, Shoto got a little distracted and heated the bathtub too much with his magic. Catherine immediately spoke up about it. This is when Shoto woke up and asked the girl to wait a bit. Then the guy used a cooling magic called Chill. Then Catherine shouted that the water was now too cold. Then the girl got to her feet and it turned out that Shoto could admire the beautiful form of the ogre girl. Catherine, on the other hand, clearly did not like Shoto staring at her. She immediately ordered the guy to turn away and stuck 2 fingers in his eyes. And while Shoto rolled on the ground and screamed in pain, Catherine calmly jumped out of the bathtub and went home. Wiping his eyes, Shoto realized that he had seen something beautiful. Because of that, he decided to keep it in his heart with the memory skill. At that moment, a naked breast came outside. It was when Shoto decided to seal this moment to himself in his memory for ages. Looking at the naked breast, Shoto already regretted that he had decided to seal this moment in his memory for centuries. Breast said he was going to get into the bathroom last, so he let Shoto go first. Shoto woke up in the morning and immediately noticed that there was a ceiling in the house. For some reason it surprised him. As he poured water into a bowl to wash his face, Shoto noticed that the weather was always great in this place and there were no monsters around. When the guy washed his face, he felt like he was on holiday in a tent camp. This is civilization. Rust at this time had also already gotten out of bed and noticed how early Shoto had gotten up. Shoto, on the other hand, simply wished Rust a good morning, wiping his wet face with a rag. Suddenly, Shoto's attention was attracted by the box on Rust's shoulders. Rust explained that he was going to fetch water, for it must be drawn every morning. The man claimed that he had to walk back and forth until the large barrel was filled to the top. Shoto then decided that if he used a storage magic called inventory, he could get all the water in one go. In that case, Shoto asked Brust to lend him another bucket, to which Brust replied that it was at Catherine's. So, with the help of Mania, Shoto could finish everything in no time, but his goal is to learn Calm Disney. Therefore, the boy decided to rely only on his own strength. Shoto mouthed off again when he said that hero skills were more useless than ever here. Brust heard the words about hero again and asked about it. Shoto again refused to explain everything and only said that he was just Shoto's water transporter now. Brust eventually led Shoto to the very river where they had met yesterday. As Brust began to draw water, Shoto asked if the water was poisonous. Shoto thought that Brust knew how to draw exactly drinking water from this river, but Brust explained that they did not know that. Shoto had already heard that the water must first be boiled and then used. However, drinking water spoils in a day, so Brust and Catherine do this every morning. Brust carries the water and Catherine boils it. Shoto remarked, holding a box on his head, that the division of labor is a good thing and peaceful living is amazing. Brust, on the other hand, thought Shoto was exaggerating a bit. When they got home, they poured all the water into the barrel and filled it completely. Shoto remarked how much water the two of them and Brust had taken in. Brust agreed with the young man and added that they could go for water no more today. Brust had done everything alone until today, but now he had Shoto. Guy claimed that the work would be 20 times more efficient. Brust, however, thought that 20 times was a lot. Shoto was even a little upset that Brust thought of him that way. The young man thought he had plenty of modesty, but it seems he was wrong. Then Shoto suggested to Brust, calling him mentor, that he take the job. Brust, however, was a little surprised that Shoto called him mentor. Shoto, on the other hand, believed that all along Brust had been teaching him how to live a new life. But Brust still thought he was a bad mentor. At this point, Shoto took note of Brust's modesty. When Shoto again drew water from the river, he suggested that Brust go home. But suddenly, Brust started patting Shoto on his back and stomach. Shoto, who did not understand anything, asked Brust what was wrong. Brust, however, concluded by such actions that despite Shoto's height, he was very strong. After all, it takes strong legs to lift full buckets of water. Shoto, on the other hand, explained that he was simply tall. Brust did not understand what level Shoto was talking about and only remarked on the young man's remarkable physical strength. At this point, Shoto realized that he had almost blabbed again. The boy realized that these ogres didn't know that everyone had a level. However, the very concept of level itself did not exist in this world. The ability that Shoto had acquired here could be called level recognition. Because of this, he was able to develop effectively. Shoto watched various training videos. There were even rumors about him. In the end, the hero reached the maximum level, gained many skills, and was able to push the limits of what was possible. That was how Shoto defeated the Demon King single-handedly and then became free. Shoto had companions, but their level was lower. Or rather, they tried very hard and were able to reach their limit. But Shoto never realized when they managed to start dating. Shoto knew that the chances of dating a beautiful girl that was also his mate were also. It was just that he was rather inexperienced at the time. At this point, Brust asked Shoto why he had his face all twisted up like that. Shoto apologized and explained to Brust that it was just a bad memory. Brust decided not to ask about it, because he realized that there are different situations in life. Shoto agreed with Brust. Brust, however, commented that Shoto had a very shrewd eye, even though he looked young. Shoto confessed that he was pondering why he was only living for real now that he had lost everything. Brust at this point walked over to Shoto and patted his hand on his shoulder. Then they began to stand together by the river and gaze off into the distance. When they returned home, they were met by Catherine with a cooked breakfast. Shoto was very happy, for he was hungry as a wolf. Catherine noticed that she had put more food especially for Shoto. Shoto was very happy, while Catherine was already putting a huge plate on the table. Looking at Catherine's smile, Shoto realized that it warmed his heart. In that case, he said goodbye to his past and welcomed his future, and then wished himself and the others a pleasant appetite and began to eat breakfast. Chotao's breakfast was very much to his liking. He devoured it with as much gusto as he had eaten yesterday's stew. Looking at the food he had prepared, Shoto realized that potatoes were the mainstay of the diet in this area. However, both the stew and the bread that Catherine prepared are incredibly delicious. Therefore, Shoto devoured everything on the table with both cheeks. And after a couple of minutes, the young man embarked on the main mission: eat the bun. So, the first thing to do to eat a bun is to cook it. But, suddenly, Chotao wondered, what are buns even made of? Is it wheat and then need the dough out of it? Question. At this point, Brust called out to Chotao. As it turned out, Brust and Catherine were going to go potato shopping and wanted to call Shoto to come along. Chotao felt that securing food was of the utmost importance, so he rushed over to Catherine and Brust. Brust, on the other hand, remarked that it was imperative to go for potatoes, for they had more eaters. Chotao took the hint and, laughing, said that Catherine was a delicious cook. The embarrassed Catherine, however, assured him that it was only boiled potatoes. Looking at Catherine, Chotao realized that she was just a cutie. When Brust pushed Shoto's shoulder a little and asked if they had convinced him, Shoto stepped on the ground with such force that a hole was formed. Brust was dumbfounded. He had marveled at how strong Shoto was even in the morning. Shoto realized that it was all because of his high level, but said it was because he had trained hard. Brust, however, decided to make a joke and said that if Shoto continued like this, Catherine might fall in love with him. Catherine heard these words and shouted indignantly at her father. She began to beat Brust on his back with her fists and assured him that he was not like that. Brust, however, only laughed. Suddenly, Chotao noticed that even the pebbles on the ground trembled because of Catherine slapping her father on the back. Orc strength is several times greater than human strength. Brust must be as strong as a buffalo. Because of their outstanding physical abilities, the orcs can live even in remote areas. Suddenly, Shoto even wondered why these two were living in such a remote area. Finally, the trio found places to dig potatoes. Shoto dug and thought that it was better for him to live here and not attract attention. After all, he is a hero for saving the world and becoming a fugitive. And he broke his engagement to the princess herself. At this moment, the princess was in the kingdom. She was sitting at her desk writing a letter. When she had finished, she ordered a servant to deliver the letter to the guilds. The servant, however, was quite concerned about the princess's appearance and suggested that she rest. The princess, however, claimed that this was just nonsense. After all, her father's foreign policy is something to behold. And there's a hell of a lot going on inside. The girl was sure that the kingdom is on the verge of bankruptcy and rest now cannot. But if Shoto were here, things would be different. The princess felt that there was no problem in just starting to threaten Shoto to come back. Shoto at this time, who was also thinking about the princess, realized that there was something frightening about it. His gut told him that the princess would use him as some kind of tool. The princess, on the other hand, was drawing on a sheet of Shoto and calling him an idiot. After a while the harvest was gathered. A full box of freshly dug potatoes. Looking at the harvest, Shoto offered to cook something like tororo. But Catherine hastened to explain to Chotao that it should never be eaten raw, for it was poisonous. The girl claimed that the poison could be got rid of if only the potatoes were boiled several times or soaked for a week. Such a period of time quite astonished Chotao. He was surprised at how many poisonous things there were in this world. In the end, Shoto realized that he definitely wouldn't be able to survive here alone. He approached Catherine and stated that he had nothing but feelings of appreciation for Brust and Catherine. The girl was quite embarrassed by such a gesture. She asked Chotao not to thank. Catherine then began to act rather strangely, hugging the potatoes. Looking at her, Shoto even wondered how she got such a big potato. After that, the guy got worried about running out of potatoes because they had dug too many. But Brust asked Chotao not to worry and explained that if they left the potatoes for a while, they would grow back. But Shoto didn't like that they were relying only on nature, for what about a steady harvest? Whereupon the young man asked Brust if he had ever tried growing sweet potatoes. Brust realized that Chotao was referring to gardening and thought for a moment. Sure, it would be nice to do it. Chotao, on the other hand, admitted that working in the fields immediately came to his mind when he thought of a peaceful life. Brust, on the other hand, said that he had actually tried vegetable gardening before, but each time it was spoilt by wild boars. Chotao, hearing the words about the boar, asked if this stew was the same, to which Brust replied that Chotao was right in his guess. Shoto then thought about how nice it would be to have a steady source of food. Suddenly, the guy thought about the fact that if they cultivated the field and got rid of the boars that came to him, they could get fresh meat and crops. He Hearing these words, Catherine asked Shoto in surprise if he was going to sow the field in this way. Shoto then asked to leave it to him. The lad declared that he would make such a field that it would withstand the invasion of the Demon King's army. Shoto claimed that then his dream would come true. Catherine, however, did not understand what dream Shoto was talking about and asked about it. Shoto, on the other hand, stated that his dream was to eat buns. True, he had no idea how to make them. Catherine and Brust didn't know how to make buns either. Brust thought about Chodo's plan and realized that it would be quite difficult. But Chodo believed that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Catherine liked Shoto's attitude, so she decided to help him. So, the first step is to prepare the ingredients for the buns. Create the perfect pitch. Then Shoto declared that he was a hero from now on. A disclaimer, Shoto the plowman. Brust suggested that Chodo use an area he had once plowed, since the hero was determined to create a field of potatoes. Upon seeing the plot, Chodo was amazed. Brust, however, warned Chodo that the boars had done a good job on the plot. Still, he thought it was better than cutting down the forest all over again. Chodo thanked Brust, for he had been a great help to him. When Shoto was inspecting the plot that Brust had given him, he found some holes. Immediately the hero thought that these pits were made by boars. The lad surmised that when the boars came to the field, Brust knocked them down. Well, then the boars would turn into stew. Then Chodo decided that Brust's labor would not go to waste. The boy believed that everything in this world was connected. Suddenly, a bump caught his eye. Digging into the ground, Shoto found a potato, which he was a little surprised by. At that time, Brust came over and said that he had once bought these potatoes in the village. Then Chodo asked if Brust had planted it. Brust said that this potato was not very hardy, and they gave him the potatoes for nothing. In the end, Brust was only able to grow thin potatoes, but even those were eaten by the boars. After that, Brust went to the barn and brought back a few tubers, which he saved. From this, Chodo concluded that these potatoes were important to Brust and asked about it. Brust, however, explained that they, the ogres, are hunters by nature, not farmers. Therefore, these tubers Brust wished to entrust to Shoto the plowman. Satisfied, Shoto, however, took the bowl of tubers in his hand. Taking one tuber, Shoto decided to examine it carefully. He realized that it looked more like an ordinary tuber than a yam tuber. Then the guy decided that it was time to use the hero skill of the dance pop. This skill was completely useless in the battle against the Demon King. However, this skill was appropriate now. So, primary school gardening lessons. Shoto now tried to remember everything he had been taught. Back then, when Shoto was just a child, he really wanted chips. Nothing had changed. Shoto, already a hero who had killed the Demon King, suddenly, he wanted fries again. Then Shoto decided that he should cut the tuber into pieces to increase the number of risings. The young man knew that if he planted the tuber whole, not enough potatoes would be harvested. That was Brust's mistake. Then, without thinking long, Chodo decided to get down to business. He used the splitting magic called the Space Cutter. At that moment, a certain ring cut the tuber into 4 pieces. The end result was exactly what Shoto needed. Shoto knew that if he wasn't careful, he could accidentally sever space and the world would accidentally collapse. But if Shoto used magic carefully, everything would be fine. At that moment, Catherine appeared from nowhere and startled Shoto with her sudden question of what it was. Immediately after that, the space distorted. The ogre house was now half in space. Shoto decided not to delay and used a time magic called Rewind. Shoto returned just as Catherine stealthily crept up on him. He managed to turn around and asked what was wrong. The guy also asked the girl not to sneak up so inconspicuously. Catherine promised not to do so and asked about cutting potatoes. So, the magic that helps Shoto notice enemies and allies nearby is called Auto Field. Guy always unconsciously uses it, yet he didn't sense Catherine's presence. This is strange. That girl seemed mysterious to Shoto. Catherine, on the other hand, had just brought Shoto a snack at this time. Shoto thanked the girl, and she wished him a good job. Shoto immediately began to enjoy the pleasant smells of her food. Then the guy looked at the gorgeous Catherine and realized how kind she was after all. Shoto even thought about the fact that he would like to marry this girl. Catherine meanwhile said, pointing to the pot in Shoto's hands, that he was already old. So the girl asked that it be broken nearby and the debris scattered. Then the clay from which the pot was made would fertilize the earth, and Brust would make a new pot. Then Shoto scrutinized the pot in his hands and asked if Brust made all the pots. The girl, on the other hand, confessed that she sometimes thought everything was possible. The clothes she sewed with her own hands, and the sagebrush near their house was Brust's doing. But they had to do it all alone. That's what's sad. Then Shoto put the pot on his head and said that now there were 3 of them, which meant that there were 10 times as many forces. These words made Catherine laugh, but the girl confessed that she felt that everything would work out when Shoto said that. Since that was the case, Catherine decided to go back to her work so that she would not lose to Shoto. Therefore, the girl wished Shoto good luck and went to the house. Shoto, however, only asked Catherine to rely on him. After the girl left, Shoto decided to have a snack. When the pot was already empty, Shoto realized that Catherine's cooking was just something. He was just overflowing with energy. Then the guy decided that it was time for him to cultivate the land. Using magic, Shoto made a transparent cube. Then he threw a pot into it and used earthquake magic called Shiver. After this manipulation, clay began to come off the cube. Next, Shoto began to shape the clay with magic. At the end of the process, he was already getting a field, which he was very happy about. Then Shoto started planting potatoes a little distance apart, placing the tuber downwards. After all, the lad felt that gardening lessons in junior high school should not go to waste. After scratching his nose with his dirty hands, Shoto, without realizing it himself, left himself a mustache and then continued planting potatoes. At night, when Shoto was already sound asleep, his siren went off. In an instant the lad woke up. He immediately realized that the potato thieves had come and jumped out of bed. To get to the station quickly, Shoto also used a speed magic called Vija. In just a second, Shoto was already in his field. The thieves turned out to be the usual boars that messed up the crops and Brust. But Shoto immediately recognizes that someone wants to dig up his potatoes or is approaching the field. This is the warning magic called Siren. In advance, Shoto apologized to the boar and said that he could not give the crop to the one. This made the boars angry. They immediately pounced on Shoto, who clearly did not expect this turn of events. Shoto, however, used the magic of stopping space. After all, for potatoes to sprout well, the ground must remain soft. At first, Shoto planned to lift the boars upwards using a steaming magic called Feather. The law of the jungle is very harsh, so the boars had a hard time, and Shoto, Brust, and Catherine are having a barbecue tomorrow. At first Shoto decided to let all the blood out of the carcass, but perhaps the guy is using a storage magic called inventory. Inside the storage, time doesn't move, so the meat will stay fresh. Thus, Shoto stuffed all the boars into his storage. As he went back to the house to sleep, Shoto thought about making a fence that would withstand an attack by thieves. But right away, the boy also thought about the fact that it might be dangerous for Brust and Catherine. Then Shoto decided to see to it himself. The next day Shoto went about his usual business. At lunchtime, Catherine prepared a meal, which Shoto happily pounced on. While the trio ate, Shoto told of the boars coming into the field the previous night. Hearing these words, Brust was very surprised. He even expressed his sympathy to Shoto. But Shoto asked Brust not to worry, for he had dealt with everyone. Brust was even more surprised at this statement, for he had not even heard anything. Shoto, on the other hand, claimed that it was all because he was a pretty good hunter. The young man also stated that Catherine and Brust could call him a boar exterminator. These words made Catherine and Brust laugh, for Shoto changes his nicknames every day. After a while, Brust asked what was the matter with the boars, for they must cut the meat as soon as possible. Then that is when Shoto opened his storehouse. Seeing this, as the boars tumbled out of the vault, Brust and Catherine were amazed. Shoto explained that this was a storage magic he had invented. It is called inventory. These words astonished the father and daughter. They thought it was a very expensive item. When Shoto heard this, he was dumbfounded, for it meant that someone else also had an inventory. Brust said that he had once seen such a thing in a workshop. Shoto asked if it was the same name. When Shoto went to kill the Demon King, he had nothing but a stick, not to mention the expensive equipment from the shop. But now Shoto's equipment was either custom made or a legendary artifact. Brust, on the other hand, remarked that whatever the case, Shoto was incredibly good at magic. Catherine agreed with her father, as the boars were perfectly preserved. Shoto, on the other hand, was just glad that Catherine and Brust liked everything. At this point, Catherine turned to Shoto and said that this was simply amazing. Shoto, on the other hand, stated that he had a request. He wanted to be taught how to butcher a carcass, so he turned to Brust again, calling him mentor. This even pleased Brust. The man did not think long and agreed to teach Shoto how to butcher a carcass. Catherine, on the other hand, looked at her father and noticed how cute he was when he was embarrassed. It even seemed a little strange to Shoto. At this point, Brust had already started to pull the boar carcass onto a tree branch with a special construction, and Shoto hurried over to him so as not to miss anything. For Shoto, learning how to butcher a boar was very important because he wanted to go into animal husbandry in the future. The boy felt that he would benefit from this skill. Brust, on the other hand, told Shoto that he would need to open the belly and take out the organs once he had drained the blood, especially careful with the bladder. At this point, Shoto thought for a moment. He thought that the essence of peaceful life was the dishes of the wild beast. At this moment, Katrina, who was also watching the process, noticed that her dad was just glowing with happiness. The girl then turned to Shoto and with a wink said that it was all thanks to him. This action embarrassed Shoto a little. Catherine, on the other hand, added that her father was always very worried about her and they had to be very careful. Catherine reminded Shoto of the moment when he asked what happens when you dig up all the potatoes. So the girl confessed that actually, they were worried about that too. At this point, Brust brooded and explained to Shoto, who was not listening to him at all and was distracted by Catherine how to butcher the carcass. Catherine, on the other hand, continued to chatter and distract Chodao. The girl told how her father was upset about the failure of the field and the boars. But who would have thought that a man who drank poisonous water from a river could breed despondency? Shoto didn't even realize at first that Catherine was talking about him. And when the girl explained everything clearly, the guy was confused even more. At this point, Brust finished with the cutting and asked Chodao if he had understood everything. But there was one problem. Shoto had listened to everything. Catherine, on the other hand, at this point said that she would continue to help Shoto. At this point, Shoto was already torn. He realized that he had to concentrate on Brust's explanation and focus, but Catherine's mouth would not close. She said that she and Brust were very happy to have Chodao. This whole situation was already making Chodao angry. He mentally asked himself to concentrate, but in the end, Shoto completely forgot what Brust was saying. He had to revisit what his memory magic had recorded. After a while, Catherine and Brust started cooking the meat. Shoto watched the whole process. Brust told Chodao that they hung the meat in the kitchen because the air was quite dry. But Brust also admitted that it was best to do it outside, somewhere in the shade. Catherine added that in that case the animals would eat all the meat. When Shoto began to cut up the meat, he noticed that there was a lot of fat in it. Brust, however, explained that such meat would not be tasty, so there was no need to hang it. Brust argued that fatty meat has a lot of moisture in it, causing it to spoil quickly. Then Chodao wondered if he should get rid of the fat. In the end, the boy decided that he couldn't do that, no matter how strong he was. At that moment, Brust and Catherine started giggling for some reason. Then Catherine asked Chodao to give her this piece of lard. Shoto handed her the piece and asked her if she wanted to throw it away. Catherine, on the other hand, calmly threw it into a future meal. Chodao was very surprised. He didn't understand what the girl was doing and tried to stop her. But after a while, when the lunch was ready, Shoto himself realized everything. Holding the plate of food in his hands, Shoto looked at the piece of fat that looked like a flower and thought about the fact that he didn't like pork very much. But when the boy tasted it, he was amazed. The taste of it started to make him break down. It was incredibly delicious and not at all like fat. Brust and Catherine smiled at this point. Brust, on the other hand, explained that if done right, the fat would curdle right away. And Catherine added that the fat could then be used to make candles or medicinal ointment. Hearing these words, Chodao was dumbfounded. He did not believe that ointments and candles could be made from it. At that moment, Shoto realized how wonderful this life was because you can get so much from one boar. 2 days later, Catherine began to check the meat. So far, everything was going as it should. Shoto at this point was already munching the meat in both cheeks. This meat was much duller than what they sell in the shop. Brust, on the other hand, remarked that this meat even tasted better than fresh meat, even though it was dried. Brust had a boar skin on his shoulder, which Shoto just couldn't help but notice. He rushed joyfully to Brust and asked if it was tanning, to which Brust replied that he would not do it this time. At this point, Catherine said she had already bagged the meat. In that case, Brust decided to go with Catherine on the business. Shoto is a shallow guy. He realized that Brust and Catherine had gathered for an exchange in the village. Brust explained that in this way they wanted to look for clothes for Chodao and find something suitable for work. When Shoto realized how much they cared for him, tears came to his eyes. Brust, on the other hand, remarked that it was uncomfortable in the fields with equipment like Chodao's, even though it was first class. Catherine, on the other hand, thought that good clothes would last a long time for Chodao. In this world, clothes cost a lot of money, all because cotton cultivation is not developed here and the common man usually has 1 or 2 things. Therefore, in summer, many people wear only underwear. Thinking of underwear, Shoto for some reason remembered Catherine. At this moment, Catherine looked at Shoto and asked why he was glaring at her. It is worth saying that this is why summer is called the time of love here. To Shoto's great regret, it is autumn now. It's getting cold. At this point, Brust had prepared everything for the trek to the village. The skins of 3 boars and dried meat. That should be enough to trade for cloth. Shoto was puzzled, for there were 3 boars. Is that not enough? Brust didn't answer that question and just scratched his head. Shoto didn't understand why Brust was silent. At this moment, Catherine's hands were shaking for some reason. She was saying to herself under her breath that they needed to find clothes for Shoto. The girl didn't want to leave, but they must find cloth. At this moment, Shoto thought for a moment. Right now, the behavior of these 2 was quite strange. Half humans like orcs were minions of the Demon King and fought against humans. That's what they usually said. Therefore, half humans are often oppressed in this world. But Shoto personally fought the Demon King's general and their subordinates. Among them, most of them were humans. They would become the Demon King's minions and attack their comrades with a smile on their faces. How many have they killed in this way? So half humans are more like victims of false rumors. Therefore, it was not difficult for Shoto to guess what awaited Brust and Katrina in the village. Then the young man firmly decided that he would go to the village with them and then no one would dare to offend them. These words surprised both of them. Rust inquired how Shoto was going to do it, to which Shoto replied that it was a secret. Rust laughed and suggested that it might even work if it was Chodao. Then, without much thought, the trio set off together. On a road full of dangers, a normal person would have to walk for a whole day, but the former hero kept pace with the ogre family. After they had some snacks along the way, Shoto decided to put all the things in his inventory so that Catherine and Brust wouldn't be heavy to carry. Brust at this point said that they were always welcome to Shoto, even if he would occasionally drop in for a visit. After all, the fact that they had a new friend in their ogre family was already a celebration. Catherine agreed with her father's words. She decided that they should celebrate it, and when they found fabric, the girl promised to sew Shoto comfortable clothes. The kindness of this family even brought tears to Shoto's eyes. After a while, a village appeared on the horizon. Looking at it, Shoto realized that the village was bigger than he thought. The boy guessed that there were about 100 people living here. At that moment, one of the villagers noticed the visitors and wanted to say welcome, but when he saw that they were half humans, he changed his tone and asked what they wanted. Brust explained that they had come to exchange meat and hides. The man from the village, however, said that he thought Brust was a villager and that the goods were not fit for exchange. Then the ignoramus turned his attention to Catherine's breasts. Catherine was walking at this time and did not realize anything. There were only drops of sweat dripping off her. Suddenly, the girl quickly leaned over to Brust, and the man from the village, who did not take his eyes off Catherine, was grabbed by Shoto by the shoulder. Shoto didn't bother with ceremony and immediately punched the villager in the stomach. The blow was so strong that the villain couldn't even say a word, lying on the ground. Brust and Catherine were dumbfounded. Shoto, on the other hand, stated that he got angry and punched the rascal in the stomach. Here the redneck woke up and shouted loudly to Chodao that he would pay for it. Then Shoto grabbed the guy's head and used the horror magic called Endless Nightmare. Now this ignorant guy would have nightmares for 3 days. And Shoto was serious about dealing with those who were molesting Catherine. Then the young man suggested that his friends go on. Brust and a satisfied Catherine did not object, and the trio headed deeper into the village. As they walked through the village, Chodao spoke of the villagers' outrageous attitude towards non-humans. At that moment there was a loud shout. "Ogres, what are demon minions doing here? This is a place for humans." The people resented the ogres being allowed into the village and insisted that they be kicked out. At this point, one of the lads picked up a stone and threw it straight at Brust's head, but no sooner had the stone traveled than Shoto stepped in and beat it back. The stone came back and flew right into the face of the same guy who threw it. This is Shoto's comeback magic called Bullseye. At this point, the villagers began to resent the stones being thrown at them because it was cruel. Shoto was annoyed. It pissed him off that the villagers were throwing stones themselves, and if they received stones in return, they shouted that it was wrong. In that case, Shoto decided to finish his business as soon as possible and return. But the villagers continued to advance. They shouted that the ogres were useless monsters and one day they would be finished off by a hero. Here Shoto's patience broke. He was very angry when the ignoramuses said about killing off the hero. After all, those who try to do good, who gave Shoto a chance to live a new life, are wished to die at the hands of a hero. Shoto had hoped to deal with it quietly, but still decided to add some fire. At this point, the roofs of the houses began to burn. The villagers went crazy and thought it was the Demon King who had come back and set their houses on fire. And it was just Shoto's fire magic called Scorching Heat. And then Hellfire. Shoto decided that the villagers needed to think about their behavior and they would do it in hell. Shoto laughed evilly and told the villagers to fear and tremble. And while they were thinking about their foolishness, Shoto wished them to burn to the ground. At this point, Catherine decided to intervene. She walked up to Chodao and hugged him from behind. Chodao, by all means, stopped. Catherine, on the other hand, looking at the fire in the sky, asked Shoto if he had done it. By this time, the flames were already walking over the whole village. Of course, Shoto should have acted like a normal person, but suddenly, he became angry and a fireball with a radius of about 100 meters appeared over the village. The people of this village felt as if they had traveled back in time when the Demon King and his army were attacking people. They were on the verge of death. Brust, on the other hand, didn't he really understand what it was and asked about it. To which Shoto replied that it was just ordinary sorcery. The young man claimed that these inhabitants were simply horrible. In that case, Shoto decided to re-educate them. But how? Brust realized that Shoto was looking for a way. He said that their race had indeed fought on the side of the Demon King. But in this village, they could get what they needed through exchange, and that was the best they could hope for. All this did not please Shoto. He objected and said that there were also many people in the ranks of the Token army. At this point, one of the villagers heard Shoto's words and said that it was a lie. He argued that humans were different from monsters. It made no sense for humans to fight on the side of demons. Shoto was already pissed off that these villagers were trying to defend themselves from the truth in every way possible. However, Shoto is completely the same. He believes that only he is right and pure. The young man was annoyed that people are obsessed with money and power, thus they are incomprehensible to Shoto. Then Shoto decided that later he would definitely go about educating people. When the trio arrived at the local market, Shoto remarked that it was quite large for such a village. Brust, on the other hand, explained that the place had become a staging post among the traders. Catherine confirmed her father's words and added that here the traders gathered in caravans and traveled onwards. When the trio approached one of the shops, the first thing they heard from the merchant was that the ogres had appeared. At these words, Shoto had already begun to roll up his sleeves to stuff his face. Brust stopped the young man with a wave of his hand. The merchant was an old woman smoking a pipe. Brust explained that they had come to exchange furs and meat. The man assured them that they needed cloth and asked how many pieces of cloth they had brought. The old woman looked lazily at Brust's goods and said that she was willing to give 3 cuts for everything. Brust was indignant, for that was too little. Last time the same old woman had given him the same amount for only 1 boar. The old woman did not remain silent at this point either. She ordered Brust to shut up and claimed that she was the only one who was willing to trade with the ogres at all. Whereupon the insolent woman sent the trio away if you don't like it. Brust still thought it strange to give 3 pieces of cloth for 3 boars. Catherine did the math and realized that only 1 shirt could be made from the 3 pieces. Shoto at this time stood not far away and watched the whole situation. The guy realized that Brust and Catherine didn't deserve this. However, the good and honest in this world are constantly being ripped off. Therefore, Shoto decided that he had a duty to punish those who do so and headed straight for the shop. He squeezed through Brust and Catherine and banged his hand on the table. Then the fellow put his finger out to the old lady and declared that it was just a robbery. These words made the old lady so angry that she bit her pipe. She argued in a rage that a youngster like Shoto could not possibly understand anything about commerce. Then Shoto presented the old lady with a special tablet using market magic called Banker. He claimed that this tablet indicated the market situation in the capital. Thus, it comes out that they should receive 15 pieces of cloth for 3 boars. The old woman realized that Shoto was right and only tisked. Then she turned on the fool and asked how she knew Shoto wasn't lying. And besides, they were far from the capital and had their own prices. Shoto laughed and asked if this place was more important than the capital. Then the old lady claimed that it was. She argued that this place is more important than some distant capital. This place has its own rules and Shoto must obey them. Shoto thought for a moment. At that moment, people began to gather around the ogres. Concerned Catherine noticed this and called out to Shoto. Shoto at that moment pretended to recognize that this village was more important than the capital. He said that the head of the central market of the capital had listened to their conversation with the old lady. At this point, Shoto used the remote communication magic called call center. Seeing this, the old lady behind the bench was dumbfounded. But Shoto had indeed reached the capital. At this time, the head of the central market was scratching his bald head, looking at what a mess the economy was in, especially in one backwater. Shoto at this moment showed the old lady with the help of magic this head of the Hajimno Central Kingdom who controlled all trade, Mr. Insat. The old woman clearly recognized Insat, as well as the rest of the villagers. Shoto at this moment turned to Insat, who hadn't even realized yet that he was being watched. When he saw the magic call center, also Shoto, he was dumbfounded. The first thing Insat began to resent was that Shoto had crossed the king and the princess and ran off to nowhere. Shoto, however, explained that it was a long story. The young man realized that if he asked Insat for help, the merchant would tell the king about him. But Rajai Catherine and Brusta Shoto was willing to take the risk. He told Insat that he would tell him later about the princess and the others. Then Shoto said another sentence. The promise had not yet been fulfilled. At this point, Insat thought for a moment, scratched his bald head, and still agreed to help Shoto. In essence, Insat is a merchant. This means that a promise to him is like a contract that must be fulfilled. Finally, Shoto explained to Insat that he wanted to know what was now the matter with buying cloth and how much would come out if paid in boar meat and furs. Insat looked at Brust's goods and saw as many as 3 boars. He began to make all sorts of calculations. After a couple of minutes, the merchant said that it would be 39 pieces of cloth at the current price. At this point, Brust and Catherine were very happy, which was not to be said of the old woman who sat behind the bench. Brust admitted that he had no idea it was worth so much. Catherine was also surprised, for 39 pieces can make a lot of clothes. Then Shoto also told Insat that here they wanted to give them 3 offcuts for 3 boars. These words angered Insat. He claimed that this was robbery in broad daylight. Insat asserted that logistics, lack of source of information affect the price in the borderlands. But so great a price affects the economy. Insat argued that it is because of such robberies that the economy collapses. Insat then asked Shoto to spread this information everywhere. In return, Insat obliged Shoto to keep silent about his call in front of His Majesty. Shoto, on the other hand, was very happy that they had sorted everything out and said that he would now send the coordinates to Insat. and Sat added that he would personally see to it and check everything to make sure that the trade was fair. The old woman, however, asked Insat to stop or their village would go bankrupt. At this point, Insat turned to Shoto and confessed that he was indebted to the young man for killing the evil spirit Dalmoth. The old woman heard these words. She obviously knew who Dalmoth was, but no sooner had Insat finished speaking than Shoto said goodbye to him and cut the connection. So, the one who invented the concept of the market and who is worshipped by the merchants, Dalmoth Taklande. Hearing that Dalmoth was an evil spirit, the old woman was astonished. Shoto, however, explained that Dalmoth destroyed trade ties within the country and was on the side of the Demon King, undoubtedly a human. These words made the old woman's jaw drop. Suddenly, Shoto felt that there was demonic energy left in Dalmoth's portrait above the shop. So was Dalmoth really using them to increase his influence throughout the country? At this point, the old lady stated that it was just a rumor. After all, what would a human do in an army of demons? All this talk was already making Shoto's ears ache. He decided to deal with it as soon as possible. At that moment, Shoto was approached by Catherine and asked what was he talking about. Shoto, however, simply asked Catherine to forget about it and reminded the old woman that she owed them 39 cuts on 3 boars. Dumbfounded at such news, the old lady simply agreed. Then the trio made the exchange and already with the cloth they went home. Shoto was very happy that everything had been exchanged well, and Sat intervened and everything went smoothly. At this point, a worried Catherine said that she thought it was all just a coincidence, but she still wondered who Shoto was. After all, the young man can do sorcery and has connections with various people. At this moment, the girl had a thought. She remembered how she and her father had hoped for 10 pieces of cloth and divided them. Then she realized that of life with her father was better because of Shoto. The girl took her construction off her back and threw it. She then pounced on Shoto from her back with a hug. With tears in her eyes, she thanked Shoto. Such an embrace even made Shoto's organs shift. As one would expect, all the Ogavs are very strong. So now Shoto was barely breathing. At this moment, Shoto felt Catherine's chest and plopped down on the ground. As if mesmerized, he had already considered that his death had come. Catherine thought it was all her fault and began to apologize to the young man. Shoto, however, laughed and told Catherine not to worry and to go on. Since that was the case, Catherine decided to thank Shoto properly. She claimed that it was because of him that they were able to barter so much cloth. It was hard for the girl to even believe it. That was why Catherine was very glad that Shoto had gone to the village with them. Shoto, on the other hand, began to rise from the ground. He stroked Catherine's head and said that the villagers were not allowed to treat those because they were ogres. The young man claimed that even when the hero fought the army of the Demon King, he did not consider any race as his enemy. Therefore, everything depends on everyone, only on him. Shoto assured that if you simplify things a lot, it resembled the village they had just been in. At that moment, the trio turned around to take one last look at the village for today. Earlier, Bruce had said that once upon a time, half-humans were not oppressed so much in the village. To inspect the place, Shoto needs to contact the kingdom. How tedious. It wasn't easy before defeating the Demon King, and Shoto thinks it has only become more difficult now. Then Shoto traveled back to the village to explain everything to all the villagers once and for all. Shoto used his memory magic called Projector to show the events that had happened before. When Dalmoth was still alive, he decided to show the hero Shoto what kind of power he had received from the Demon King. Then Dalmoth showed Shoto his true form, a demon in the heart of the Hajimno kingdom, the evil spirit Dalmoth. Dalmoth claimed that commerce was invented by the Demon King and everything that man created was only necessary for the Demon King to subjugate it to himself. All the villagers watched with the projector as Dalmoth once claimed that he only bows his head to beings that have power. Dalmoth had decided to simply destroy Shoto since the young man did not want to submit to the Demon King. Dalmoth claimed that his portrait simply slowly sucked out the energy of idiots who asked for wishes to be granted and transferred that energy to the Demon King. That night the villagers burned Dalmoth's portraits, and the old woman realized that they had simply been tricked. The woman claimed that the villagers were very wrong and the half-humans were not bad at all, and even among humans there were traitors. The old woman could not understand why she could not realize such a simple thing. At that moment, Shoto realized that the curse had disappeared as soon as he burned Dalmoth's portrait. The old woman, however, eventually decided to apologize to Catherine and Brust for everything. Shoto, looking at this curmudgeonly old lady, realized that she had once been a talented merchant. She realized the fact that they were too stupid. At this moment, the projector showed the way Shoto was killing Dalmoth. Shoto realized that he had forgotten to turn off the projector, and the old woman's jaw dropped again. All the people looking at the projector realized that Shoto was a hero, so they all got down on their knees and began to apologize for what had happened this afternoon. Shoto, on the other hand, realized that this was a big problem because the villagers realized that he was a hero. Although, when you think about it, what will become of Brust and Catherine? Then Shoto still decided that it was a good thing that the residents realized that he was a hero. After all the thinking, Shoto made a loud proclamation to all the villagers. He assured that he was the hero Shoto and now he was hiding his identity. Therefore, the hero asked the people not to tell anyone about what happened today. The young man even went up to one fellow and, putting his hand on his shoulder, said that everything had much to realize. Shoto then asked all the people to listen to him. The hero asserted that people can make mistakes and correct their mistakes. After these words, the villagers started praising Shoto and calling him a hero. Shoto was very happy that everything ended so well and he did not burn down the village. And the villagers realized that it was better not to make Shoto angry, for he was even scarier than Dalmat. So, Shoto has changed the villagers' minds and they will also keep their mouths shut. But Shoto was in no hurry to return to Catherine and Brust. He sat looking at the chickens and tortured himself with the thought that someday Princess Trappia would find out where he was. In that case, Shoto didn't know what he should do. He spent the night at the house of a kind old lady, and when it was time to go home, he told her about it. The old woman asked Shoto to wait for a second. She said that thanks to Shoto the village was as it was before. The old woman regretted that she could not thank the hero properly, but now in her spare time she was raising birds. Shoto had already realized what the old woman was implying and asked if he could have one of the birds, to which the old woman replied that Shoto could certainly take the bird, but she was also concerned about how the hero was going to carry it. Shoto, on the other hand, stated that it was not a problem for him. A short time later, Shoto was already at the ogre's home. He did not come empty-handed, but with a whole bowl of eggs. When Catherine and Brust saw the eggs, they were dumbfounded. They had not seen them for a long time, so they asked Shoto where he had got them. Shoto explained that he had simply told the villagers a story and as a sign of reconciliation they gave the Hawlok and the eggs. The Hawlok bird is similar to the rooster that lived on Earth. Catherine was amazed when Shoto said that he had made peace with the villagers, and Shoto added that no one would ever hurt the ogres again in this village. Brust and Catherine were simply shocked. Catherine immediately went up to Shoto and began to thank him. The girl then suggested celebrating the occasion with a dish of eggs. Shoto thought it was a wonderful idea, but he asked her to leave some eggs. Catherine asked why, to which Shoto replied that they would make chickens hatch from these eggs. Shoto had already thought of everything. He planned to raise the Hawlok chicks and then provide himself with eggs. This was Shoto's first time trying to raise someone in this world. In junior high school, he raised aquarium fish, though they all died. When Shoto remembered this, he doubted his abilities. He assured himself that it was all right, for he was a hero and knew many spells. At that moment, Catherine, looking at the worried Shoto, asked what was wrong with him. The girl also heard the young man saying something about the hero. Shoto, on the other hand, began to excuse himself and assure that he had said nothing of the sort. The boy stated that he was now Shoto's animal breeder and would try very hard. The hero tried to convince himself that everything was fine, because so far he had managed to do everything by himself. While Shoto protected his friends, was able to defeat the Demon King single-handedly. At this point, Catherine called out to the distraught Shoto and asked if it was difficult for him to do everything alone. At that moment, the hero had an epiphany. He realized that he had completely forgotten that he had Catherine and Brust by his side. Brust, meanwhile, had doubted whether they would be able to lay eggs. He suggested that they try with one egg and then take on the others. Brust had been taught that way once. Shoto liked the idea. In the end, they decided to start with one egg. Shoto then thanked his friends. He said that he would know who he would rely on when he was short of strength. Brust and Catherine themselves were always glad to help Shoto, for thanks to him they had received many weavings and the villagers had become kinder to them. In that case, the friends agreed. Shoto was very glad that already now he had reliable comrades. The hero realized that a peaceful life could not be led alone and it was better to do it among friends. After a while, Catherine prepared a puffy omelet from the eggs that Shoto had brought. Shoto was very happy because he was very hungry and wished everyone a pleasant appetite. Brust was also surprised at such a feast. Shoto tasted Catherine's omelet and, as always, could only savor the wonderful flavor. He liked that there were already many different colors on the table. Finally, there was also a yellow one. The young man thought that they would always have many dishes on the table if they could get eggs steadily. In that case, Shoto decided that he and his friends were obliged to breed chickens. Whereupon Shoto asked Catherine for an egg. Catherine handed Shoto a bowl of one raw egg. Shoto, however, asked the girl to give him another egg. Catherine, on the other hand, pointed her finger at the omelet and said that everything was here. Shoto realized that everything had gone into this delicious omelet. Then the young man also realized that there was only one egg left. Holding this one single egg in his hand, Shoto wondered what to do if the chick didn't hatch. It seemed to the young man that everything would start with him. This is when Shoto realized just how different responsibility is in this case. Looking at Shoto raising that egg, Catherine realized that it was her fault that she had wasted all the eggs on the omelet and there was only one left. The girl apologized and explained that she just wanted the omelet to turn out as big as possible. but Shoto asked Catherine not to worry. The hero claimed that everything would work out with just one egg, whereupon Shoto reiterated that Shoto the cattle farmer was using the maximum of his strength. He would also ask Brust and Catherine for help and then safely raise the little chick. After a while, Shoto went outside and sitting down on a log, thought about what it would take to incubate an egg. So, a suitable temperature, a safe environment, and a few days. True, it doesn't make sense for Shoto to stay home all that time, watching to make sure the egg doesn't break and keeping it warm. At this point, a pensive Shoto was approached by Catherine and asked what was wrong. To which Shoto replied that he was just thinking about how he could lay an egg without distracting himself from his work. The girl, on the other hand, claimed that it was not difficult. Catherine believed that it simply required magic. At that moment, Shoto had an epiphany. He realized that he could just use magic and asked Catherine to hold the egg. Shoto himself had already started to think of a plan. First, he planned to use cold magic and volcanic lava, plotting to create a protective barrier stronger than stone and iron, and then gravity magic for better control. In the end, all that was left was to combine everything. Having done all the necessary actions, Shoto clenched the resulting fist, causing the surroundings to light up brightly. Then Shoto unclenched his fist and saw the magi emerge. To call this heat preservation magic, the hero decided to magical seed. But immediately afterwards, the young man thought about magic and magic repeats itself. But, in the end, Shoto and himself realized that he did not know how to give normal names. So, right now, the young man was planning to use this magic seed. At this moment, it was as if the egg had turned into a seed. Shoto touched it and realized that gravity and heat magic were under control. In that case, the last test remained. For her, Shoto bared his sword, which shocked Catherine. Shoto planned to strike the egg with his sword. It is a blade capable of crushing a troll's skull. But when Shoto touched the egg with the blade, it remained just as intact. The young man was very happy that he had succeeded. Catherine was also very happy. Shoto, on the other hand, went up to the girl and declared that it was all thanks to her. Such an action even made Catherine blush. Shoto liked how cute Catherine was when she blushed. Catherine meanwhile assured that she had not even done anything. The young man said that he would like to practice some more, but he had work in the field waiting for him, so he started to get away quickly. Catherine, on the other hand, simply wished Shoto good luck. On the way, Shoto met Brust, who thought the lad was busy with the egg. Suddenly, he saw an egg on the guy's head and asked what is it. To which Shoto, of course, replied, an egg. Shoto explained that he had taken some measures to keep the egg from breaking. Brust, on the other hand, felt that one could not worry if Shoto said so. Shoto's magic is meant for battles. However, this spell, which is stronger than a battle spell, was created for peaceful purposes. At this point, Shoto noticed how many trees Brust had cut down. Brust, however, explained that he thought it would be a good idea to expand their field. The man thought they could get new saplings since relations with the villagers had improved. Shoto was overjoyed, for he was one step closer to making buns. All that remained was to grow wheat. Shoto then decided to get to work immediately. He realized that the stumps had to be uprooted and took a good grip on one of them with his hands. Bruce told him that he could not pull the stump out even if he pulled with all his might. No sooner had he set about digging up the ground around it first than Shoto pulled the stump out with the root. In fact, with Shoto's hero strength, it couldn't be easier. Brust was simply amazed at looking at this sight. He always had to work with a shovel, and Shoto pulled out the stump so easily, because the young man's strength amazed Brust. But Shoto assured him that it was all training, and from that day on Brust could call him Shoto the Uprooter. The stumps here have long, thick roots, so it is difficult to get rid of them without a horse or an ox. At this point, Brust decided to try again to uproot the stump. He took a good hold of it with his hands and pulled with all his might. He succeeded after all. Thus, Brust was able to accomplish such a task all by himself. Compared to other kinds of creatures, ogres have impressive physical strength. Well, in Shoto's case, it's because of his level. So he once again took hold of another stump and pulled. Suddenly, something appeared from under the stump. It was a giant cicada, demon insect. It can attack humans. Shoto was surprised to see it. At that moment, the cicada did not hesitate and attacked Shoto. It aimed its sting straight at Shoto's eye, but he managed to dodge. Now the egg, which had been lying on Shoto's head all this time, was on the verge of life and death. It was good that Shoto had time to strengthen the defense of the egg. The cicada flew away from the egg and Shoto in a flash. The young man was glad that everything was alright, because if he hadn't strengthened the egg, it would have definitely shattered. After all, the cicada seemed to Shoto like a nasty insect. Brust, on the other hand, was very happy that Shoto had caught the cicada. He claimed that these guys were very tasty. Shoto, on hearing these words, was dumbfounded. He could not even imagine that cicadas eat. So there you have it. A peaceful life is sometimes frightening. After a while, Shoto took up the task of cutting wood again. He was very glad that he had become so good at it that he could now be called Shoto the woodcutter. At this moment, a silhouette appeared behind him and swept up that Shoto was once again coming up with these strange nicknames. Shoto didn't even turn round at first at the voice and claimed that the nicknames weren't strange. The young man claimed that it was proven that self-hypnosis improved performance. Finally, Shoto turned around. Behind his back, he saw Insat. Insat the first noticed that Shoto had an egg on his head. From this, the merchant concluded that Shoto was once again engaged in something incomprehensible. Zadie and sat down next to Shoto and told him that he had gone to talk to the villagers. He realized that this place was indeed far from the capital. Shoto realized that Insat was talking about the village, so he was even a little surprised that Insat had decided to personally check things out. Insat, on the other hand, explained that he was just forced by someone, alluding to Shoto. The merchant said that the villagers had told him that thanks to Shoto they were on the path of correction, and the situation inside had begun to change for the better. Insat admitted that he did not think he would have to deal with this after Shoto's victory, but until now the situation was unclear. However, Insat surmised that the villagers were trading with one of the Demon King's generals. Shoto didn't know that and asked how was that possible. However, he surmised that trading with the general was quite brave. Insat, on the other hand, surmised that it was the work of Dalmat's subordinates whom Shoto had defeated. Although they belonged to the demon army, but they did not look different from ordinary humans. Insat didn't like the fact that they were saying the same thing all over the country. Since it's a human, he can be trusted. But the main political power of the generals was the people. That is the bitter truth. Shoto agreed with Insat, after which the guy asked the merchant if he had received his message, to which Insat replied that he had received the message and that was why he had a question. Insat claimed that as Shoto's friend, he wanted to make sure that the former hero lives and does not cause trouble to those around him. That is why the merchant wanted Shoto to introduce him to his patrons. This request quite surprised Shoto. But after a while, Shoto had already brought Insat to Brust, who was still busy chopping trees. Then Insat turned to Brust and, extending his hand for a handshake, thanked him for taking care of Shoto and for having picked him up in the first place. Brust, on the other hand, recognized the head of the central market and, extending his hand in return, remarked that Shoto had such a distinguished man as a friend. Insat, on the other hand, explained that Shoto had just helped him a lot once. The merchant argued that if it weren't for Shoto, he would have died. Brust agreed with Insat and added that Shoto is indeed incredible. Brust also talked about how Shoto had just saved him and Catherine, and his daughter even began to smile more often. Hearing these words, Insat concluded that spring had come for Chodao as well. Looking at the two of them, Chodao realized that this was too much. He felt as if he was in a circle of relatives who were happy for him. Then it was still a reminder that Shoto was unemployed. At that moment, Catherine looked out of the house and shouted that dinner was ready. Upon seeing Catherine, Insat realized that it was Brust's daughter. Catherine was frightened of Insat and hid behind her father's back. She recognized the merchant that Shoto had spoken to using magic in the village. Shoto laughed and said that he too would be frightened if such a big man came to him. Brust at this point suggested to Insat that they have lunch with them. He claimed that Catherine cooked as well as the capital's chefs. Such an offer Insat could not refuse. After tasting the lunch that Catherine prepared, the merchant was surprised. The food was indeed delicious. Shoto confirmed this and said with confidence that Catherine's cooking was the best. The girl was even embarrassed by these words. She, all of a sudden, said that before it was only her father and her at the table. Then Chodao came and now Insat also came. Thus the girl wanted to say that she was just very happy. Insat, on the other hand, admitted that he was very surprised when he heard that Shoto was hiding somewhere on the outskirts. However, this was something that the merchant had not expected at all. But now he realized that he could not worry. Insat admitted that he was even a little envious because he had to work every day, and ever since the Demon King was defeated, there was even more to do. Today, Insat was very happy because he was finally able to enjoy the peace of the mines. At this point, Brust became reflective and suddenly suggested that Insat go fishing. Hearing this suggestion, Catherine declared that she would also go. Chodao also liked this tempting suggestion. The girl, too, thought that Shoto was definitely a good fisherman, but Shoto only laughed smugly. In fact, this is not true at all. The young man has no experience in this matter at all, and his fishing skill is the worst. Through gritted teeth, he asked his friends to call himself Shoto the Utter. But Insat decided to burn Shoto and told everyone that Shoto had never caught a fish in his life. Of course, Shoto didn't like the fact that the merchant had ratted him out. In that case, Catherine promised Shoto to teach him how to fish. After a while, the friends found a good fishing spot. Insat was the first to notice how good and clean the air was, and Shoto, without thinking long, decided to start fishing. Of course, he didn't know how to do it, so he asked Catherine about it. Then the girl asked if Shoto didn't know how to do it at all, to which Shoto replied that he really did not know it at all. In that case, Catherine, calling herself Big Sister, decided to teach the boy everything. Hearing the words about Big Sister, Chodao was perplexed. He did not even realize that Catherine was older than him. Brust, however, explained to Chodao that Catherine was just trying to act like a teacher. Catherine did not like the fact that her father had revealed all her cards, so she indignantly asked him to be quiet. But Chodao had already realized it all himself. He stroked Catherine's head and called her sweetheart. Then Catherine declared that she refused to teach Shoto how to fish. In that case, Shoto bowed down to the girl and asked her very much. Catherine, however, simply could not refuse Shoto. At that moment, it seemed to Shoto that Catherine looked like a Koroin. Catherine at this time had already started showing everything to the guy. She assured him that the first thing to do was to take a long stick and shape it into the shape of a fishing rod. After a while, Chodao was already sitting with the rod in his hands and waiting for the fish to bite. He noticed how warm the weather was and how great it was. The young man surmised that Insat was thinking the same thing. In fact, Shoto missed having such a holiday, but just in case, he decided to use magic that would wake him up if the fish bit. Shoto was very sleepy. As soon as Shoto closed his eyes, his siren went off. From the surprise, the young man hit his head on the ground. When he came to his senses, however, he explained that he thought the fish had bitten. At that moment, the river was indeed turbulent. As it turned out, the fish had indeed taken Chodao's bait. Catherine, looking at the fish, noticed that it was big. Shoto at this moment tried to reassure himself that catching fish was a simple task for the hero who had crushed the Demon King. So he pulled the fishing rod with all his might, wanting to catch a fish. Catherine tried to stop Shoto, but it was too late. It happened that the fishing line came off the rod and Shoto went tumbling to the ground. He ended up sealed into a rock. Looking at this, Brust was a little surprised and asked if it was because the fishing line had broken. And Sat explained that it was because Chodao always gives his best, no matter what he does. At this point, Shoto had already risen to his feet but continued to squirm in pain. He was a little hurt that he had been done over by some fish. At that moment, Catherine came up to him and asked him if he was alright. Shoto only thought that he had not felt such a fool in a long time. Since the young man ignored Catherine, she called out to him. Shoto, however, explained that he was fine and completely calm. But that was not really the case. Shoto was serious about catching all the fish with a freezing mania called the Ice Age. Here Catherine realized that the young man was clearly not himself. No sooner had he finished saying the name of the magic than Catherine grabbed him by his clothes and began to rub him, demanding that he stop using magic. Brust and Insat, meanwhile, were quietly fishing and watching. After a while, Shoto calmed down as well. He apologized to Catherine and admitted that he lacked the equanimity to cope with fishing. Catherine, on the other hand, was just glad that Shoto understood. She explained to the young man that he was in too much of a hurry, but it was his first time, so it was okay. At that moment, the fish took Shoto's bait again. Catherine also noticed this and said so. Shoto, on the other hand, had already started pulling the rod towards him. The girl at that moment went to Shoto's back, grabbed him by the shoulders and asked him to calm down. The girl leaned her breasts against Shoto's head. The boy felt it and was embarrassed. At the same time, Catherine noticed how big the fish was. The young man agreed that the size was large, but he was clearly not referring to the fish. Catherine asked Chodao to watch the fish and, when the moment was right, to pull. The girl herself would help Chodao hold the rod. Suddenly, Catherine realized that now was the time to pull the rod and shouted this to Chodao. Then Shoto pulled the rod with all his might and the boys managed to pull the fish out of the water. The young man was even able to catch his catch in his hands. The overjoyed Catherine, on the other hand, started clapping her hands. Brust and Insat were also amazed at such a sight. The fish was indeed big, so Brust decided to roast it for dinner. The friends decided to have supper right beside the river, and Sat began to cut up the biggest fish that Chodao and Catherine had caught. At this point, Chodao decided to start a fire. He thought that just summoning magical fire was boring and told Brust about it. But Brust didn't think so. He claimed that it would be quick, so there would be no problem. Shoto then decided to try a telekinesis magic called Clash. Using this magic, the two stones began to rub against each other quickly. As a result, sparks began to appear. In the end, Shoto had it all worked out. The boys now had a fire on which to cook the fish, and Sat at this point pointed out that this was a rather dangerous spell and could be used to destroy a city to the ground. But Shoto believed that what serves the great can also serve the small. The young man argued that fire could be dangerous, so he asked the others to stay away. And Sat, on the other hand, began to cut up Shoto's large fish. Catherine, passing by, apologized to Insat for having to take care of the fish. Insat, however, asked the girl not to worry about it. He claimed that he had already forgotten about all these problems in the market. First you wait for the bite, then you catch the fish and eat it. That was why Insat thought this holiday was just fine. He was very glad that he decided to check things out on his own and went to the outskirts. Shoto at that moment remarked how difficult it was for Insat. Insat did not deny this. He claimed that it had become difficult, especially after a hero had escaped from the kingdom. Here Shoto pretended that Insat wasn't talking about him at all. Catherine, on the other hand, looked at Insat and Shoto and remarked that they were good friends. Insat agreed with the girl, for he and Shoto had shared both joy and sorrow in the capital. Shoto, however, recalled how he and Insat had sat on Dalmuth's tail and then dealt with him. These words impressed Brust. He even remarked that Shoto was acting quite like a hero. These words made Shoto a little tense. He approached Brust and asked if he had to make up some kind of hero, to which Brust replied that he didn't make up any hero. He just thought that Shoto was doing a lot of amazing things, just like a hero. But Shoto thought that with the level he was at he couldn't do anything complicated. At this point, Insat asked Shoto if he was aware of what was being said about him. The merchant rubbed Shoto's head and said how good it was that the young man lived here and didn't worry about anything. Insat's kindness touched Shoto. After Shoto returned from battle, he was something of a fearless warrior. Insat, on the other hand, at this moment reminded Shoto how that fish escaped from him and then he was going to freeze everything. Remembering that situation, Insat laughed again. At that moment, Catherine came up to Shoto and said that his fish was ready. Shoto was very happy, for it was his first catch. Without thinking long, the young man took a bite out of the fish. The flavor seemed great. Insat at this point decided to calm Shoto down a little by saying that he was not going to tell anyone that they had seen him. Such words even made Shoto exhale. Insat, on the other hand, added at that moment that the princess suspected something. These words made Shoto choke on his own fish. Insat assured that he did not think that the princess could have come here, to the outskirts. Shoto, on the other hand, asked Insat not to even think about it. At this point, Catherine realized that Shoto knew the princess and was surprised to ask about it. At that moment, someone's glowing eyes were watching the carefree friends from the bushes. The next day Shoto was tending to his vegetable garden. Catherine, who was passing by, asked him if he tended the potatoes, to which Shoto replied that of course he did, because he was a farmer. The young man then decided to go and fetch water from the river, taking with him a huge barrel. Catherine saw Shoto off and wished him a good journey. After a while Shoto was on his way home with the barrel full of water. Suddenly, outside the house he noticed a strange stranger. Shoto saw him for the first time, so he did not understand anything. At that time, the stranger noticed Shoto and wished him a good day. Shoto asked the stranger if he was a guest. The same claimed that he had heard that there was a hero in a village nearby. Of course, Shoto was not thrilled at these words. He realized that the villagers had let slip about him after all. At this time, the stranger noticed that Shoto was getting nervous and asked the young man to calm down, calling Shoto a hero. Shoto, on the other hand, claimed that he was no longer a hero but a farmer Shoto. The stranger then addressed Shoto as Farmer Shoto and again asked him to calm down. The stranger claims that with great difficulty he questioned the villagers and, after getting one soldier drunk, finally learned what he wanted. However, for some reason, to the stranger's surprise, this soldier was then beaten, accusing him of wanting to ruin their village. Shoto was even a little upset, because until now he had tried to keep everything secret, even asking the villagers to do so. But the stranger claimed that he was curious about something, so he came. Whereupon the stranger in the hat took out a book and showed it to Shoto. Shoto looked at the book and read the following title on the cover: A Visit to the Lands of the Kingdom of Tujanar, author K. Klo Lok. At this moment, Shoto realized that the author of this book was standing right in front of him. The hero began to praise Klo, for he considered him a true master, as if he were a man from another universe. But Klo claimed that he preferred the title of scientist to that of writer. So, when Shoto lived in Japan, he bought a lot of e-books and developed respect for writers. He would send feedback to the author on Twitter and attach his elaborations and ideas. But unfortunately, when Shoto did this, his account was blocked. At this point, Klo remarked how still nice and humid the air was in this place. In that case, he decided to take off his cape and reveal his identity. Behind the cape appeared the face of a frog. As it turned out, Klo Lok is a reptile man. At this moment, Catherine passed by the guys and thought that Shoto was talking to a frog. When the girl realized that it was a reptile man, she apologized to Klo. Klo, however, just laughed and said that in some ways he was indeed a human frog. At this point, Brust also noticed Klo. At first he thought it was guests, and then he thought it was just a frog. Catherine got angry at this and asked her father to stop talking. At this point, Klo said that a society of half-humans like him had received information that a neighboring village was favorable to creatures like half-humans. Also, Klo had heard that a family of ogres outside that village was trying to cultivate the land. This whole situation even surprised Brust a little. He didn't think they were being discussed, but Klo thought it was really surprising. Brust assured that they were persecuted in their homeland and had no place to live, so they had to set things up for themselves. These words stuck in Chotao's mind and he asked Brust if they had been persecuted, to which Brust replied that the pursuers thought the half-humans were minions of the Demon King. When the sun rose in the small duchy of Efsinal, it lit up the wheat field entirely. But now the duchy was gone. Catherine, on the other hand, added that this duchy was swallowed up by a strange light, and then everything turned to ashes. Chloe seemed to be aware of this situation as well. He assured that no one still had any idea what had become of the duchy, but it was a great tragedy. Here Shoto thought about the duchy of Efsinal and the mysterious light. So, the duchy of Efsinal before the destruction. There was an immortal duke there named Efsinal. He assured that he would sacrifice all the inhabitants to the demon king, and in return he would receive an indestructible body. And he had one opponent. Efsinal claimed that he would not die no matter how many people burned him. The duke assured him that he would turn all the inhabitants into a docile army of dead men and replenish his immortal army, and then destroy the kingdom of Hajimno to the ground. But the duke's opponent suddenly used the hellfire he had just invented. At first, Efsinal called his opponent a fool. Duke was just sure that his opponent could burn everything but himself. But suddenly, Duke's body began to burn. That is when the whole neighborhood was illuminated by this mysterious light. So, Efsinal's adversary was Archodao. He realized that he was at fault, but if he had let the Duke turn the inhabitants into undead, things would have become much more complicated. That's when Shoto burned everything down. Only now did he realize that it was too much. At this moment, Brust was talking about how great it would be if their small field became bigger. In the meantime, Chloe called out to Shoto and asked if the young man could show him the field. But Shoto asked Chloe why he would do that. To which Chloe replied that the field was a stronghold of peaceful life. He claimed to have learnt a lot about the field while he was working on the book. Chloe assured that he enjoyed it very much. Shoto was shocked to hear these words. In that case, he decided that he simply had to show the field to Chloe and asked him to follow him. After a couple of minutes, Shoto had already led Chloe to his pride, the potatoes that had not yet grown. Then Chloe looked at the stalks of the potatoes and remarked that they were rather weak. These words struck Shoto. Chloe opened his book and showed Shoto and Catherine the potatoes he had sketched for his book. It turns out, if we compare Shoto's potatoes with CLR's, Shoto's potatoes now look more like beans. At this point, Catherine asked Chloe if he knew that beans are often found in the eastern part of the country. Chloe, meanwhile, said that he was now definitely convinced that Chotao's plants lacked nutrition. Chloe assured that not all the sprouts were getting enough nutrients. In addition, the boys were watering the plants too much, whereupon Chloe took some soil from the vegetable garden with his paws. After that, Chloe sniffed a little bit of earth, and Shoto stood next to him and did not understand why Chloe was doing that. Chloe at this point concluded that the soil was obviously low in nutrients, it was too loose. Then he asked Shoto what he used as fertilizer. Here Shoto wondered. Finally, he asked Chloe what is fertilizer. Such a question made Chloe's jaw drop. Chloe, however, could now draw a conclusion from what he had seen. So, the land on which Shoto keeps a vegetable garden is unsuitable for farming. Chloe assured him that he needed to prepare it properly with fertilizer. This was the first time Shoto had heard of such a thing at all. At this point, Chloe turned to Brust and Katrina and asked why they had entrusted the field to Shoto. Brust replied that among the three of them, Shoto was the best at growing potatoes. Catherine confirmed her father's words and added the fact that Shoto could do anything. At this point, Shoto picked up on how disappointed Brust and Katrin said these words. Chloe, on the other hand, at this moment realized that he had been right to come. Chloe then stated that the boys could rest easy. He assured that they would make the fertilizer together. At this point, Shoto wondered why Chloe was so excited to talk about it. Chloe, however, explained that there would be more potatoes in that case. Shoto then decided to take up the task with Chloe. So, the first question Shoto asked was, what would it take to make fertilizer? To which Chloe replied that human waste should be used as fertilizer. Shoto was puzzled. Chloe, on the other hand, assured him that, simply put, one needs what one digests food into. Whereupon Chloe asked the boys where they got rid of all this stuff. To which Brust replied that they dig a hole for it. Chloe, on the other hand, assured him that it was just fine. He added that straw, ashes, food scraps, and fish bones would also be good for fertilizer. In that case, Catherine decided to bring everything. Shoto was surprised to learn that it could really all be used as fertilizer. Chloe, on the other hand, explained that fertilizer used to be made from whatever was on hand. Chloe assured that if they prepared the field well, it would not become as fertile as the lands of the Duchy of Efsinal, but it would still be a great place to grow wheat. These words dumbfound Shoto, for his dream is the wheat field. The young man dreams of eating Catherine's stew along with the bread. Shoto also planned to show Brust that very landscape one more time. Then Shoto shook Chloe's hand and asked him to help them. Chloe agreed to definitely help since he was asked by the hero himself. After a while, the boys showed Chloe where the human waste pit was located. But, as Shoto pointed out, there is now a toilet standing there. So Brust picked up the toilet and carried it somewhere in the forest. Shoto explained that they moved this stall when they dug a new hole. Chloe found this tradition quite interesting. Shoto, on the other hand, leaned over to the waste pit and, reminding Chloe of his words earlier, asked if this was really the fertilizer for the field. To which Chloe replied that, on the whole, it was. However, Chloe added that this alone should not be used. It would do more harm than good that way. With these words, Chloe took the shovel in his paws. Chloe assured that this was why everything had to be properly cultivated. This process requires real courage. With these words, Chloe began digging through the waste with his shovel. Shoto, on the other hand, stood nearby and could only cover his nose against the horrible odor. Chloe laughed and agreed with Shoto. Then he threw the fish bones that Catherine had brought into the pit and said that long ago in peasant communities they had to do the same thing. Shoto then stated that he understood everything. He stated that to cultivate a field, to live a peaceful life, is to overcome oneself and fight every day. Then Shoto also decided to help Chloe. After a while, they finished. Chloe assured that the air temperature and humidity were just fine. Good fertilizer, it turns out. But for Shoto, it still stank badly. Chloe, on the other hand, explained that the foul odor should disappear after fermentation. Then it would resemble yogurt or alcohol. Shoto got very excited about this and asked if the point of the fertilizer was to make it smell good. Chloe explained that it's just the way it is. That's why it stinks. Chloe assured that after a while the smell would disappear. Shoto then realized that the smell would get better by the afternoon. Whereupon Shoto inquired whether fermentation was a good way. To which Chloe replied that this way is just fast. At this point, Catherine smelled a vile odor from Chloe and Shoto and shoved them out the door, ordering them to go wash up. Shoto's nose, on the other hand, was already used to such an odor at all. Chloe explained that when this happens, you can no longer smell the odor. Shoto then declared that he could heat water quite well. Chloe, on the other hand, warned that he did not like boiling water and preferred lukewarm water. Shoto understood and said he could maintain the right temperature and heat the water to perfection. These words made Chloe's jaw drop back again. He didn't think they would go straight into the bathroom. After a while, Chloe and Shoto were already taking a bath. Shoto had prepared himself and used a copy magic called clone to have his clone constantly adjust the temperature while he bathed. While sitting in the bath, Chloe picked up on the fact that Shoto warmed the water perfectly. Shoto claimed that he was just good at conjuring. However, it is much easier than making fertilizer. Shoto then decided that henceforth he would be Shoto's fertilizer maker. In that case, Chloe suggested that fertilizer maker Shoto should make a beautiful field together. So to the peaceful life of Catherine, Brust and Shoto were joined by Chloe Loke. The next morning the friends sat down to breakfast together. Suddenly, Shoto's attention was drawn to the process of eating Chloe's food. Without thinking long, the young man asked Chloe how he could taste the food if he swallowed it at once. Chloe laughed and explained to Shoto that they frogs recognize the taste of food with their esophagus. Chloe assured that frogs enjoy food when they swallow it. Chloe also added that the Hollock, whose egg Shoto carries on his head, has a similar structure. Suddenly, Chloe asked Shoto if this egg would hatch soon. Before Shoto could answer Chloe's question about the egg, he was interrupted by the annoying repetition of his name. As it turned out, it was Catherine, who hesitantly said that she had succeeded. And, while Chloe and Brust continued to enjoy their morning meal, Catherine led Shoto outside by the hand. She claimed that she had everything ready. Looking at Catherine taking Shoto by the hand, Brust had already begun to imagine their mutual children. When Shoto reluctantly went outside, he asked Catherine what she had made. Then the girl pointed out to Shoto his new clothes. Seeing his new clothes, Shoto cheered up. He liked it very much, and the size was also his. Then the boy decided that he should show the skill of Catherine's hands to everyone. At this point, Brust and Chloe were sitting at the table waiting for Shoto and Catherine. Brust could not stop imagining his daughter in her wedding dress. Chloe, on the other hand, was more interested in what Shoto and Catherine were doing outside. After a little thought, Chloe remembered that yesterday Catherine was sewing something. At this time, Shoto had already put on his new clothes sewn by Catherine. After doing a few physical tricks, Shoto realized that the clothes fit him perfectly. Catherine was especially pleased. She had sewn the clothes so that they would not tear during the work. At that moment, Shoto realized that it was not worth it to test the clothes for durability, so he apologized to the girl. But Catherine assured that it would be no big deal even if the clothes were torn. No sooner had the girl said, but her attention was attracted by something on Shoto's head. At that moment, a shell sprinkled from the guy's head. As it turned out, the Hollock's egg had cracked. Both Shoto and Catherine were very surprised and excited. At that moment, Chloe and Brust came out of the house. Seeing that the shell had cracked, they were also shocked. Then Shoto removed the egg from the head and put it on the surface. Now the boys began to watch the birth of the chicken friendship. Suddenly, Catherine noticed the chicken side moving and said so. Everyone took it very reverently. At this point the egg stopped moving. Displeased by this, Shoto wondered what had happened. Chloe, on the other hand, assumed that the chick had simply decided to take a break. But Shoto knew that it was this chick that would determine their future fate, and now it was up to him. The physical power magic called Fight allows you to harness the power of tomorrow right now. That's when Shoto decided to use this magic. But before the guy could even say a word, Catherine covered his mouth with her hand and loudly declared, "You cannot." The girl claimed that now the chick was trying his best and they could only watch him. Shoto understood everything and did not go against fate. At that moment the top of the eggshell fell off. In a few moments a little chick fell out of the shell. On seeing it, the four squealed with happiness. Shoto was ready to faint from the cuteness. He was the first to reach for the squeaking baby. His hand trembled, but the chick reached out and rubbed its head. Shoto almost died from the sweetness of it. Catherine laughed and said that the chick had definitely decided that Shoto was his mother. These words even embarrassed Shoto. Chloe, on the other hand, said that he had heard that fledglings mistake what they see immediately after birth for their mom. Then Shoto began to coo at the chick. After a while Catherine suggested that the baby be given a name as it was now part of their family. Shoto supported this idea and suggested the name Hope, for they were all waiting and hoping for the baby to hatch. What in the world is it? Hope? It is a dream full of aspiration. And, finally, victory. Suddenly, Shoto declares that he has made up his mind. So, the victory is Victory, which means that the young man already knows what the chick will be called. But no sooner had Shoto even voiced the name than Catherine interrupted him and said that the name he had come up with was too long. So the girl decided that the chick would be called Torimaru. At this point, Shoto felt depressed. Catherine, on the other hand, admitted that Shoto didn't know how to give a title. For this the girl apologized to him. Shoto, on the other hand, covered his face with his hands and asked Catherine to stop it. The young man thought he was just pathetic. But Shoto didn't plan to complain about Catherine either. He decided that the chick would still be called Torimaru. Holding the little one in his arms, he decided that he would raise him and then they would have more colics. This is where Chloe surmised that it was already a whole bird farm. Shoto dared to suggest that Chloe knew about it, but Chloe argued that it was beyond his expertise. But Chloe knows that chicken droppings make excellent fertilizer. Shoto then concluded that when Torimaru got bigger, they could increase their crops. Chloe, on the other hand, pointed out that in the case of bird farming, there was a good chance that the chick might be eaten by wild animals. Shoto could not even imagine such a cruel outcome, so he decided that he would make a place for Torimaru to live. Here Brust had already guessed everything, but asked Shoto if he was going to build a chicken coop. Brust said that he had often had to make chicken coops when he was a carpenter. Shoto then set about persuading Brust to build a chicken coop for Torimaru. Brust didn't even object. He only asked Shoto to rely on him. Brust also revealed that he and Chloe were planning to build a house, which meant that enough wood had to be harvested. Chloe, on the other hand, added that if the boys wanted to build canals for the rice field in the future, a lot of it would be needed too. In that case, Shoto suggested that his friends go cut down trees. But, suddenly, Brust stopped Shoto and said that the trees for construction must be dry, otherwise they would rot during the work. But the whole point is that in the forest it takes years for trees to dry out. So Brust stated that they would go and buy them in the village. Brust assured that getting a tree was much easier now because thanks to Shoto they were able to sell the hides and meat. After some time Catherine, Brust and Shoto were already in the village they knew. Chloe had not gone with them, so Catherine said it would be nice if he went too. Chloe explained that for him the journey to and from the village was akin to a whole journey, so he decided to stay home and keep an eye on the field. Shoto, on the other hand, was worried about Chloe, so he asked if he would be okay. Chloe laughed and asked Shoto not to worry. Chloe assured that everything would be under control. In that case, already in the village, Shoto sent Brust and Catherine to the market, and himself went about his business. The first thing Shoto did was to find his grandmother who shared her eggs with him. By the way, he saw and called her when he saw her. The old woman greeted the hero, and he began to show her the chick Torimaru, which hatched from her egg. The grandmother took the chick in her hands and remarked how pretty it was. The old lady also determined that it was a male. Only now did Shoto learn that his Torimaru was a boy. Shoto explained to the old woman that he and his friends had eaten all the eggs except the one from which Torimaru had emerged. Therefore, the young man asked his grandmother to give him the egg in order to breed a mate for Torimaru. The old woman told him that a bird had hatched from the egg the other day. She was happy to give it to Shoto. Shoto thanked the old woman, for she had just saved him. At this time Brust and Catherine reached the market and came to the same old woman from whom they had taken the cloth. When the boys approached the old woman and said they had brought meat and hides, she did not think they were ogres and asked them to look at the goods. But when she came to her senses, Granny's pipe flew out of her mouth in surprise. The old lady immediately started looking around, trying to see if the hero was with the ogres. Brust at this time said that they wanted to know how much the tree was worth. The old woman assured her that she should look at the hides and meat first. Brust then gave her what she needed. Eventually she gave the boys a leaf and said that it would come out to so much. Looking at the sheet, Brust was unpleasantly surprised. Looking at the expression on her father's face, Catherine thought at first that the price was small. but Bruss scratched his head and said that the price had increased a lot since last time. The old lady to explain that there was a demand in the capital, so the wood had gone up in price. She then grudgingly asked the ogres to find another place to buy if they didn't like something, but Bruss said that this price suited them. Whereupon the old woman wondered if the ogres were going to build a house. She assured her that the sum was large, but she allowed the rest to be brought to them later. This time she decided to deduct the cost of meat and hides, the cost of wagons and donkeys. At this point Chodao was already approaching his friends. As he approached the shop, he asked Bruss how business was going. The first thing Bruss noticed was that Shoto had brought new chicks. Hearing Shoto's voice, the old woman even jumped up. She thanked the boys for the purchase and began to assure them that from now on she was living honestly. Then the old woman began to ask Shoto how he was feeling. Shoto to ask the old woman to stop trembling at the sight of him. The old woman went on to say that she had to find wood, prepare a wagon and donkeys, and therefore, of course, the payment would be appropriate. But Bruss still felt that he had been cheated. In that case, Shoto decided to look into the matter, for the young man did not like to see any one person benefit in trade. Shoto knew that for someone who worked here all the time, there was no such thing as an equal exchange. So the lad asked the old woman how much the tree would cost at the regular price. The old woman handed Shoto a piece of paper with the price on it in reply. Shoto looked at the leaf and fell silent. The old woman assured him that since the piece had come, the prices of building materials had gone up everywhere. The old woman said that the boys could borrow money and pay later. Shoto, however, decided to act differently and asked his friends to wait a little longer. Using magic, he decided to rush to the capital's main bank. When he entered, he told the employee that he wanted to take all his money. The employee, however, without looking up, said that this bank was only for large depositors. But as soon as the employee saw the hero standing before him, he immediately jumped up and greeted Shoto loudly. Shoto ordered the man to shut up and just let him withdraw the money. Shoto then decided to look at the current rate. The worker, on the other hand, claimed that the rate was the same all over the country, though the news was slow to reach the outskirts. At this moment Princess Trappia was in her chambers mercilessly beating a pear with Chodao's face pasted on it. The servants, who were also nearby, praised the princess, but Trappia claimed that she wished she could beat up a real hero. At that moment a servant ran into the princess's chambers and announced that the hero's bank account had changed a lot just now. Hearing such news, Trappia was dumbfounded and asked if it was definitely Chodao, to which the servant replied that this was unknown to him. He claimed that the unknown person used magic and flew away immediately. The servant also provided a bank statement with Shoto's account. Looking at the statement, Trappia wondered why Shoto needed so much money, whereupon the princess asked if Insat, who was always working, had taken a holiday. The servant, however, only asked if he had to return it, to which the princess replied that it was useless to do so, whereupon the girl ordered the servant to go to Insat in a flash and see where the transaction for the amount of money Shoto took from the bank would take place today, and then go there at once. The princess was very happy that they had finally got on Shoto's trail. She was glad to finally meet this young man. Although, no, not like that. Trappia decided that she had to meet Shoto, and woe betide him if she didn't. At this point, Shoto had already returned from the capital to the village with a sack of money and gave the old woman the cash. The old woman took the sack in her hands and asked if Shoto had brought exactly 23 coins. Shoto grudgingly asked if the old lady had realized this by weight. The young man argued that this was the going rate in the capital and he was not going to work with dishonest merchants. In fact, Shoto surmised that the rate would rise tomorrow out of great demand. In that case, the old lady made concessions and provided the cart and donkeys free of charge. Such gifts Shoto likes. In a little while all the purchased wood was already in the cart. Rust, on the other hand, could not stop thinking about how Shoto had to pay a lot of money after all. Shoto asked Rust not to worry about it. Catherine was also very amazed looking at such a large amount of wood. Suddenly, the girl thought about the fact that Chodao was going to raise a Kalak chick, nurture crops, and she could do nothing. At that moment, Catherine was called out. It turned out to be the same old lady with the pipe. She asked Catherine to bring clothes to sell next time. The old woman assured her that she would take Catherine's clothes even more than the hides and meat. The old woman guessed that it was Catherine who made the clothes for Chodao. She also noticed that the clothes were well made and were just right for working in the fields. The old lady assured me that here on the outskirts, such goods are always in great demand. These words surprised Katrina a little. She hesitated and tried to say something, but the old woman interrupted her. She assured Katrina that there were no good seamstresses in the village, so it was not a bad job. The old woman also added that she didn't insist. At this point, Catherine firmly stated that she would bring clothes for the old lady next time. But still Catherine did not understand what was so good about her clothes since she was an ogre. But the old lady argued that it was not Catherine's fault. Granny believed that she was the one who had not paid her bills. After saying this, Granny took a long piece out of her pipe and then put the sharp end of it to her tuft of hair. With a single wave of her hand, the old lady cut off her hair. She realized that the old hag's hair was not of such value, but she assured that she was truly sorry. The old woman said that she would wait for Catherine since she had decided to bring clothes to sell. To her, Catherine's things would be worth more than the rest. The old lady even obliged Catherine that the others would make sure of that too. Then Catherine thanked her grandmother for such words. At that moment, Chodo called out to Catherine and noticed how cheerful she was. Catherine, on the other hand, said cheerfully about how good it was that there was peace now. Chodo agreed with Catherine. Catherine, on the other hand, said about how grateful she was to the hero who killed the Demon King. Chodo supported the girl's words and said that now one could not worry because the hero would defeat the Demon King again and again. After saying that, Catherine had some questions. Chodo realized that he had burned himself again and assured that the hero was just a killer of all demons. Catherine, on the other hand, laughed and said that Chodo speaks as if he knows the hero. After this conversation, the trio went home with the logs. At this time, somewhere in space, an unknown object was rapidly approaching the Earth. The Demon King's minions, who were sitting around a large vat of fire, sensed the approach of the real Demon King. They were sure that the hero, ordinary people, they were no equal to the true king. After traveling 3,000 worlds, the Demon King would descend to Earth, drawn by the hatred of his minions.